the main questions that you have regarding the topic on hand. Today, we're really focused on thinking about volunteers and classmates and how you get those established to help you in your fundraising efforts. We will have a call later this month that's going to be focused on fundraising at a larger scale, bringing in more statistics around the education space, giving behaviors across different age groups and channels and all of that. So this is kind of part one of two, but if people want to maybe put their name and school name in your Zoom box so people know where you're joining from, that's always nice. And I'll start sharing my screen so you can see what we're talking about. Is everyone seeing the Fundraising with Volunteers slide right now? Great. All right, so as I said, like today's call, we're really hoping to be able to focus on how you have volunteers, so fellow classmates, be able to fundraise to assist your efforts. Some of these slides might be familiar if you've joined in previous roundtables, but the intent is to really focus in on, while we spoke about volunteers at large, what we want to really hone in on is what this volunteer looks like for the purpose of this specific role. So we have templates, all of these will be shared out afterwards, but I encourage when it comes to volunteer management, you really focusing on what the description of the role is, what the traits and requirements are to be successful in role, what type of nurturing and training might be required, as well as what type of metrics you want to be tracking. This whole situation makes you more aware of what's the lift on your side, what are you asking from your volunteers, and making sure you're finding the right volunteer for this specific role. You might have some really eager people to help, but if they don't have the skill sets or the time for this specific type of volunteer role, it might be better ultimately to ask them to support in other ways. So with that said, this is an internal document. I do not encourage you sharing this out externally by any means. I think it's useful to have when you're talking about this with your teammates, or if you're asking others for help and saying, hey, do you know someone who could be good at this role? But this is very much an internal document, so you can just be tracking. I don't want just a volunteer. There's specific volunteer roles that you need to be a little bit more aware of. So for today's call, we're going to be really focusing on fundraising volunteer. So these are going to be those that are requesting donations from classmates. Now, this is where you want to be a little bit aware of, are you thinking about this role as a specific event, like a Giving Tuesday, or is this year round? Is it for a capital campaign? Is it for annual giving? That is going to help you understand the timeline of when you should be recruiting people to how much effort you're asking of them. Is it specifically around a day or a weekend? Or is your hope, hey, over time, can you reach out to all of your classmates? Or are you going to have multiple people supporting the same class year? Now, with this in mind, you also want to think numbers. How many volunteers are you needing to mobilize? Are you focusing on the specific major reunion years, or is this across all of your alumni years? And how much time and effort is that going to take for you to manage? There are systems out there, and I'll walk through just some ideas of, even if you don't have an actual system, there are ways to track even on a spreadsheet on how to manage all of this. But you need to understand your lift, your day-to-day. You're all wearing multiple hats. How long does this take to manage multiple people? And how can you kind of try and synthesize this to scale it? And do you have support? Do you have an alumni council that might be able to help mobilize some other classmates, things like that? So this is kind of the focus. I'm going to be pretty broad in terms of requesting donations year round versus specific dates, but if you all want to focus on one of those initiatives, please feel free to put in the chat and we can make sure to talk further about that. The volunteer characteristics for fundraising is pretty particular, I'd say. It's more sensitive than some other ones where you can kind of talk back if there's talk back support and everything if there's an issue per se at events. You've got other staff member there that would visually see it. These are people who are representing your school and who you trust without you per se seeing everything, being able to eloquently ask in a very, conscious and appropriate way for funding on behalf of your school. So when you're thinking about these individuals, you want to make sure that they're eloquent, they're trustworthy, and that they can adjust if someone replies back saying like, I had a horrendous experience, like don't contact me again, or hey, I love this. Like they're going to hear the spectrum from their peers, or they might hear nothing. And that also is a characteristic and a persona type that this volunteer needs, is they need to be okay with people not responding. They need to be empowered by you, but also be okay if the escalation is negative or positive. You're also trying to think through how people adjust live time to conversations. If you're conversing, if you're encouraging them to be emailing, to be texting, to be phone calling, those channels each require a different level of communication. Live time being on the phone versus email where they can always check back in with you. So what you're trying to think through is not only here are the characteristics and requirements for the profile to be successful, but also what they're doing with the information. To the point of the trustworthy side, how are you giving them contactable information of their constituents? Are you sending them a spreadsheet of here are the people I want you to contact, go? And does that mean that you're not going to see any of the communication that they're doing? You have no control of what they're doing with the emails or contact information after the fact. That's really why you want to have that trustworthy side. This screenshot is just what we have for wavelength volunteers. So this is literally just instructional for the volunteers to reach out to those who have and haven't donated, to like the data health coverage. But that's the other thing you want to track is if you send a static spreadsheet to an alum saying, please contact these people, if someone donates to your school directly before that alum reaches out, what is that experience like for a donor to have already given and then be recontacted? So do you have like Google Sheets that are sharing live time, whether someone's given or not? Do you have other donor platforms that are tracking both the donations in and what your volunteers can see? You really want to think through, how am I providing materials to my alumni base, as well as what can they do with this information on or off a platform or outside of donation tools. You hate to be pessimistic, but there are always those people who might not think clearly about, oh, I now have this list, maybe I reach out to them because I've got like this book signing event. We've actually had that happen before, where we've had an alum try and like reach out to the school saying, can I get a full list because I want to distribute this, and like my book is selling or starting to be sold, can I reach out to the entire alumni base? Not thinking that that was an inappropriate ask. So you want to think through both how are you providing the information to them, but also how many people are they reaching out to? Similar to what I said at the beginning of the call around how many volunteers you're trying to mobilize, or how many you're overseeing versus perhaps others are, what is your ask for your constituents, for these volunteers? Are you asking them to each reach out to someone over email, where email is copy and paste a little bit more, so maybe it's faster so they can distribute to a larger base of people? Is it texting? Is it phone calls, which takes a little bit heavier lift and some people are more uncomfortable with? Also from phone calls, you can definitely see a generational shift of like, why are you calling me? So you want to think through how they're getting the information and how they're reaching out and how much you're asking them to reach out. Is the ask in an intensive, very short period of time to our talk about a specific giving day versus an extended period of time saying, hey, over the next 3 months, can you contact this number of people? Does anyone have any questions so far with what I have covered here? Or topics you want to make sure we cover? Cool. So I've mentioned kind of the determine how and what channels you should reach out to. And you want to think through the pros and cons across all of those channels. So to my point around time management, how much time it takes to do each of those tasks to however many people. It's the same with your ability as the volunteer manager or your team's ability to observe the communication and control the narrative. So with phone calls, if you're not doing like a phone-a-thon and being right there to be able to help answer questions, you need to be able to trust that that person is able to ask the right questions, ask for the right donation, with the right, some people are going to be asking, what's the school up to nowadays? Like, how has it changed? Or like, how is it responding to XYZ crisis that they're seeing across the news? What you want to really be able to do is observe the communication. And it doesn't have to be like nitpicky or big brother-ish of every single communication, but I do think that it's valuable to have a view into what's being communicated out and being able to track. And we'll talk about tracking a little bit later on the call today. The last thing is kind of the ease of how the alumni are able to reach out. Are they sending a link to a donation page? Is there a QR code? How are they trying to promote the donation? You really want to reduce the number of steps someone has to make to actually get to that donation page or that actual, like, click the button, I'm inserting my credit card. There are going to be people who want to write a check or do otherwise, but it's going to be a lot. We're in the digital space where you're seeing a lot more giving done from the phone, not even just a desktop. So having the digital capabilities so that people can give anywhere is going to be really important. And it's also, how are you going to be able to get your volunteers to send something out that's not too clunky? The more you scroll, and I'll talk about this in the templates, but the more you have someone who's scrolling because there's too much content, you lose people early. So what you want to do is have the material so that if they want to learn more, they can, but you don't want them to have to keep scrolling to actually get to that call to action too far down in the text message or that email. We also haven't talked direct mail at all. Direct mail can be pretty successful for a lot of schools as well. And again, sometimes there's a personal touch and it depends on your capabilities and people's time, but having a quick handwritten note from someone, especially if they've donated quite a bit, like, there are useful tools to make people feel more personal in terms of outreach. So if I've given before, having that recognized in the outreach to me saying, hey, thanks for being a loyal donor, rather than a generic message of, say, giving again this year. What will you give this year? So having some personalization is always useful. So while I've been talking about class agents or whatever you want to call them, being like fundraising volunteers, you can actually also personalize it in other ways. You can think about personalizing by like sports teams or other group initiatives that happened at your school, so that there's that additional touch point of, hey, like, as soccer alums, it's really exciting to see how well this season was. We're fundraising for this specific effort. And so it doesn't have to also be year-round fundraising, but you can actually be focused on fundraising for, the new soccer field or nets for this. We've had schools be really successful with targeted fundraising because it makes the alum feel seen for what they did on campus, and they feel better about knowing exactly where their dollar is going on campus exactly. So if you've got the role description defined, if you have figured out like the profile requirements and characteristics, the next step is really thinking through the nurture and training needs. So having templates that are editable so that someone can say, I don't have to just create something from scratch. You're going to give me an email template that I can repurpose to be in my own voice. or like this text is a really helpful thing. You want to be able to provide them as supportive documents as possible. The good news for you is that once these are created, you're really not going to have to do much to change them year over year, except tweak specific facts or dates or what have you. But the template itself, the meaning behind it is going to be pretty straightforward. We've talked a little bit about the contact details. They're going to need access, be it through a portal or through you sending them, I would say, a spreadsheet. Regardless, what you need to have is give them the resources to be able to reach out to people. If we take a step back, before we started this presentation, Amy and I were talking a little bit around data, and you first need contact information on your alumni. There are actually probably a lot of your alumni that have each other's contact details. So if this is a trusted group of people, you could actually start before that and say, hey, here's the contactable alumni, but if you happen to know the contact information for any of these other people, we'd welcome you reaching out to them. Or if you feel comfortable, please update us. I'm going to share that literally yesterday, I was on a school call. We're about to do a alumni council presentation next week to their group because we're launching with them. And it turns out that the database set that they sent me, 3 of their council members' emails were not included in their database that they sent me. So it clearly shows that the database that they are relying on is old and antiquated. They already knew that, but it's so old that they didn't realize they're communicating with alumni in their own email inboxes, and it's not updated within their database. This is not the first time. So I think what's really helpful to do, it's really hard from a database perspective to have a full visual of what data is missing. If there is a way for you to be able to call out all of that data that's missing, putting it into something visually useful to you, be it, and I'm going to scroll back up here, be it kind of a coverage base here so you can see the data health within class years, or if it's a spreadsheet, and I don't have fake data to show this, but if it's a spreadsheet of here are the people missing, have it alphabetized by last name, by class year, and try and just have your team do a quick view over it, you're actually going to be able to catch some pretty distinct names of like, oh, like we actually are communicating with them, and fill in some missing gaps. You probably know more than you actually realize, or it's just helpful visually to try and change up going through a very heavy database of a bunch of data and change the visual to try and really see who's missing or not. The last 2 pieces that I want to focus on around training needs is information about the school, FAQs. So when you are empowering your volunteers to reach out to individuals, what you want to do is have them bolstered with information about what's happening at your school today or what will be happening in the future. A lot of alumni, I've mentioned the nostalgia of the past, they're going to feel connected with each other, but they want to see that the school is also moving forward. Some of them are going to be really beholden to, are you sticking with the traditions? And others are going to be beholden to you trying to like advance into the future. So this is where volunteers, if they are going to become in a dialogue with people, having them see information about the school so that they can provide actual information is going to be helpful. FAQs, that's including like, hey, how can I give if I don't want to give online? Like give them information. This is information you already have in your head, and it's just having it written out so that they can reference it. The last thing is the escalation procedures. This is where, again, you don't want to scare, there are no scare tactics here, but you just want to be able to have procedures in place if the volunteer doesn't feel comfortable answering questions, saying, you know, this is a really great question. I'm going to redirect you to so-and-so who is going to know more. Or if they have any questions, they'll know who to reach out to, whether, you know, if it's a time frame of we're trying to give during Giving Tuesday, I need to get on someone's radar today. Who should I contact? Is there a phone number? Versus I heard about this question, let me reach out to an email inbox. Is it a generic alumni email or a specific person I should be asking? We talked about this on a former roundtable, but you also don't want to overwhelm your volunteers with too much because they're all of a sudden going to be like, whoa, 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 What have I signed up for? And in reality, what you want to think about is having these resources available so that volunteers know that they're there, but it's not like they need to have all of that information immediately available, specifically the last two bullets, right away. So having them know where to reference this information, great. But having them explicitly review all of it so they have a little bit more concern about the what ifs, that's probably going a little too far. That said, back to my point around if you're sharing contact details in a spreadsheet over email, you lose complete control of what that document does after the fact. It's the same with all the other materials you give them if you're giving them in a digital form. So escalation procedures, FAQs, all of that information, you want to make sure that it could potentially get out publicly. And you don't want that to happen, but you need to make sure that these documents would be okay if they were not seen by a non-volunteer. It's very rare when that happens, but you just want to, cover your bases so you're not having to try and backtrack at any point. Any questions so far around anything I've covered today? Great. So the next thing is really around like success tracking and how are you thinking about making sure all of the tasks are completed and what the engagement and success rates are for this type of role. So how are you monitoring the campaign? Yes, the focus is likely going to be on the participation and the dollar rates, dollar amounts, but you also want to be thinking about, are the volunteers that you're asking to do this task actually completing what they're doing? Have they reached out to absolutely everyone? Have they reached out to a partial list? Because regardless of the dollars in the door, there could be dollars on the table that you've missed out on simply because the volunteer couldn't complete their task. So you want to make it easily accessible so they know what they're supposed to be doing, so you can track whether or not that's been completed, and make sure that if they haven't completed that task, that you have the means to be able to take that on and send out an email to that group that might not have been contacted yet. So these visuals, again, these are just wavelength visuals, but what you can kind of see is there are tasks lists. You can do this, like Google has, Gmail accounts have task tracking. Most email accounts have task tracking. They're all different online portals that allow you to do this as well, where you can be assigning people a task with a due date and making sure that on that date that whether it's completed or not. So you can start to track who's done what and try and make sure that you're covering all of your bases. To my original point around number of volunteers you're tracking, this list of 3 gets kind of crazy when it gets to a list of 50, 75, more than that. So what you want to do if you're just starting out with mobilizing volunteers is I would start small. You're going to learn a lot from just the first year or 2 of managing that group. And you're going to be able to make sure that you're in the right direction of setting expectations, that these are the right type of volunteers you want to support, and that the reception from the classmates is positive. On top of that, the first one to really focus on is you can actually be focusing on young alumni who you might already have contact with, that might already have been more engaged, focus on participation. And then you can focus on the larger reunion years, and that immediately gets you to a list of like 8 to 10 volunteers. And that's what your focus can be year 1 without you doing every single year. Otherwise, what I would do if you do have the ability to do more than that, if you have people already engaged, you could ask them for those filler years that they are classmates of, and then start to identify, this is just a tracking approach, what years are missing? Who do you not have a volunteer for? And this way, if you have an explicit list written out of I do not have volunteers here, you can visually see that as you're going about your day-to-day, seeing donations come in the door, seeing attendance at different events, and you could actually start to flag people and see, okay, they're more active over here, I'm missing someone from their year. Maybe I talk to them. Are they interested, or would they know someone? So you don't have to do a lot of the legwork yourself, other than I find visually it's helpful to list some of these out. We think we can track everything in our head, but we've got so many other things we're tracking. If you visually are seeing stuff in front of you, it's slightly easier to track things this way. So when it comes to volunteer success tracking, you've got, number of people reached out. Are they completing their task list? The number of donations, the amount of the donation. There's so many other things you could be tracking, but what you really want to focus on, what you should be tracking, what you can be tracking, and like, what are you actually capable of tracking? So the capabilities are going to differ depending on what systems you use. And if someone's using their own email to send out, you might not be able to see what the open rates are for your volunteers compared to if they're using an email system. But there are different ways that, again, it's like what you coulda, shoulda, woulda type thing of, there are a lot of things you can track. What you really should be focused on are the engagement statistics of those that are actually giving, and the amounts to, are your volunteers completing the tasks you're asking, and how many they've actually reached out to. And then understand there's going to be lower percentages of giving by class year because you're not contacting everyone, because you don't have everyone's contactable information. So if there's a way your volunteers can support that, that's going to be really essential to help, even like outside of giving. If you can get more contact information on your constituents, it means that you can engage with them further by getting them on the newsletters, by inviting them to events, and then they can give down the line if you've lost contact with them. One thing, I'm going to click quickly out of this presentation, and I'll get back to it in a second. But from one thing I forgot to bring in is this improved data health. This is something you can easily do yourself as well, where we have a table here that shows, okay, of someone's data, this is all fake data, of someone's data, what is your coverage of how many people have emails? How many are missing emails from your total alumni base? This value of a data point, and I wanted to call this out, is how much money you're potentially missing from donors simply because you've lost the contact information on your constituent base. So if you do the math from lost value, basically it's, let's say you send 10 emails out to people, you or your classmate sends 10 donation requests out, and one person gives $100. If you do the average of, like, it costs, basically, it's $10. The value of one email is $10, because over the 10 emails, those $100, only one person gave. So it means that the value of that data point, that email, is $10. This data value is editable, so it would change. What you need to understand is that some people respond to emails, some people don't. That's why you want to think about your mailing campaigns. You want to think about your phone numbers. So if you haven't actually tracked this, it would be really interesting from your own giving, if you have the ability to know where someone's given from. Is it from an email campaign? Is it from a mailing campaign? Is it from phone, be it text or a phone call? Can you track how much is given depending on what channel you've reached out to? That will help you understand which data point is the most valuable for you. And all data points are essential, but is there a specific channel that gets more money? And if there's a channel that gets you more donors in the door or gives you higher donations from that singular data point, is that where you should spend your efforts in terms of directing your volunteers or your office to reach out and focus on your volunteers just doing basic participation? So you really want to think through what channel, and if you can track it, is there a difference between someone's giving across each of those channels? You also might notice that, 80% of people give from like online email or social campaign push. So you also want to think that through of, as you look at your base of donors, not only which place is giving the most, which channel rather, but also, are there pockets of generations that like to give a certain way? You have the data. It's hard to unpack, but you have it to be able to see that. And those trends are going to be able to influence what your next campaign will be. And we'll definitely be talking about that more when I bring in one of my sales managers, and we have a call later this month on that. Going back to the presentation, what I want to focus on is kind of full circle of, we've talked about you having a volunteer need, we haven't really talked much about finding volunteers, and we'll get into that in a second, but we've found the volunteer need. You've thought about what materials you need to onboard them. So what type of FAQs, what templates, what contact information they need, are there systems you have in place? You then want to think about actually mobilizing them. So how do you track it? How do you monitor? How do you support them? But the 3 sections we haven't gone through is really that recruiting stage, the nurturing stage. So if you want to have them return back, as well as the recognition stage of how are you supporting these volunteers so that they return, feel recognized for the work that they're doing, and will help you in the future. This doesn't have to take a lot of time, but it is worth a step so that they can return back. And the biggest lift for a volunteer is actually finding them and getting them onboarded. It should be pretty easy to maintain this circle down here. So once they're in this mobilization cycle, as long as you've set expectations of, hey, this is like would happen once a year, do you want to come back next year? And you've been able to make them feel supported in role, that they could complete their role successfully, that they're recognized that they helped out regardless of how much they got in the door. That's really essential. When it comes to the searching and recruiting of volunteers, it goes back to the engagement concept of, if you have someone already participating in other ways, those might be easy to target to say, hey, are you interested? If they're the ones that are local attending the events, if they're the ones who are interacting on social media or reaching out to you for questions, or maybe like they've helped out in the past, you want to have people that are already positive about their experience with you so that they feel like a great front for your school to be asking for donations. On top of that, if you track whether someone's already been in role before, so if they were a class like president while in school with you, or they had a leadership role where their name would be recognized by a variety of your classmates and your alumni base, having those names that are recognized, well liked, those are helpful to help bring more dollars in the door as well. So when you're searching recruiting, I mentioned it earlier, start small, start with that group that is going to be people you already know, or that might have name recognition around those big class years. And then use the network that already exists. Try and crowdsource. So if you are new to your role, or if there are people that have been in role for a while, and it doesn't have to be in the development space, but if there are people and faculty that have been around for a while, and you approach them and say, hey, I'm looking for a volunteer, do you have any ideas in these class years? They might, because trust me, there are alum who stay in touch with faculty members that stay in touch with each other a lot more than they're going to stay in touch with you. And that's not a negative to their relationship with you or your department. It's just because they have that personal touch point that they're staying in touch with in the first place. So identify that volunteer need, recruit, but recruit small to start and then grow over time. The onboarding, I would try and do it as like a group effort, so you don't have to do it one at a time. It makes people feel less alone too as a volunteer, that this is a group effort, but you just want to make sure you've got the right protocols protocols in place, excuse me. So if you have expectations of, here's your task list, this is what I'm going to send you, you just give them clear instructions. And then that mobilization should be pretty easy after that. The recognition does not have to be anything big. It could be a simple like thank you note, and whether that's an email or like handwritten, if you have extra swag from the campaign, whatever it is, that recognition is valuable. Mobilizing too with classmates, sometimes a little friendly competition between class years gets people going. So, recognition could be both to the volunteer, but also to the class years, and celebration of everyone's participation, but a special shout out to these class years for all of their work. And you could actually name drop and these volunteers for helping to mobilize their class year to move this forward. So there's a lot of ways that that recognition could work, but any shout outs to the volunteer to make them feel, seen is helpful. The ongoing nurturing training, in this case for volunteer donations, really is minimal other than making sure they're okay to be supporting in a future year. But the nurture and train aspect is just to make sure that you don't lose them and have to re-onboard new people. If people say, hey, next year I can't do this again, ask them to say, hey, do you have someone else in mind instead? Because that can actually help get more volunteers in the door as well. Any questions about what I've covered or this kind of process around volunteering? Cool. So I'm going to end with kind of the consideration side of these things because I kind of have been speaking about volunteering in silo. There's a lot that you need to think about as your larger job goes, and this is where are your other efforts? When a campaign is happening, you're not only dealing with volunteers, you're trying to go to major donors, you're working with the school. There are all the different efforts happening, and it's not just around development and fundraising. There are other initiatives year-round that is happening. So what you want to think about is your timeline, not only of when am I asking volunteers to help? Is it those singular days or is it this singular time frame in terms of, oh, we're doing a springtime push? What you also want to think about is going back to this recruiting map and this whole volunteer map. How long is it going to take you to identify volunteers, to get a call on the schedule, to actually get them onboarded and then ready for them to be mobilized? You need to think through the amount of time it's going to take you to just get them up to speed. Hopefully that lift isn't too high, but it is something that is, a consideration that you need to build into your day-to-day schedule, because some of this recruiting also and some of these conversations have to happen outside of typical work hours. Your volunteers are doing their own jobs, they're having their own lives. Sometimes you're going to have to do evening calls, and trying to manage evening calls across everyone's busy schedules is really tough. So work out your timeline of when you want them to be mobilized to when you're going to be recruiting and getting them ready for mobilization, and map that to what's happening at your school and to what else you're doing in your daily schedule. I always encourage looking at your school schedule and looking at blackout dates. Like, when are your holidays? When are you off? Because it's very easy to say, oh, 3 months from now, we're going to do this. But if you don't remember, oh, there's this break and that break and this holiday, you got to kind of loop those into limiting your time frame. When it comes to timeline, you also want to think about that with communicating with your alumni base. So if you're telling your volunteers to reach out to their fellow classmates, what else are those classmates receiving from you as a school? Are they being contacted by you all at the same exact time, or are you reaching out to them on behalf of the school for donation purposes before, during, or after those touch points with the fellow classmate volunteer? What we're really lucky about in this space is that you are an alum yourself from whatever schools you've attended. So always think back about your own experience of, if I'm contacted this very same day that the school is reaching out to me, that a classmate is reaching out to me, is that overwhelming to me, or is that positive because I know it's a giving day, or is this a longer campaign and you're just spamming me, give me a little bit of space? You want to think through that entire experience, and you're lucky enough to know what that experience is like yourself. Or you can also ask the volunteers for their suggestions. But think about the timeline in which the asking is being done and the reciprocal experience of an alum. How many touch points am I receiving from the school, from the volunteer? And is it all donations based? As a school, are you putting out materials or celebrating, a 75th celebration of the school being active? And are there materials they're receiving outside of just, you're asking me only for money? Or do they, when they're receiving requests for donations, is it in addition to, and oh, by the way, like, don't forget you have these upcoming events or these upcoming initiatives we'd love you to participate in. Having alums see the value of their donations is going to be key. When it comes to the number of people that each person reaches out to, you can either set the expectation in the job role. So I'm going to go back here. If you are asking someone to volunteer, you're going to set expectations with them and say, hey, would you be willing to do this? We expect it to be about this much time, and this is what you would be doing. You could either say, tell us how many people you feel comfortable with reaching out to, or can you do this entire, your entire class group? When it depends obviously on your approach and priorities there, but you could either put it on the volunteer to say, I feel comfortable reaching out to my 10 closest people. I'll tell you those names. Done. Moving on. Or you could say, volunteer, I'm asking you to reach out to everyone, even those you might not have been super close with as a classmate. Think about, who they feel comfortable reaching out to, and are there people that you should be reaching out to as well? Whether that's because of major giving, whether because you know that they might be, I'm not going to use the PC terms here, like problem alum. You want to think through the lists that you're sending out. Are there people that you as an institution should be the ones to reach out to instead of the volunteers? Have that in mind before you start sending lists out. Or before you ask the volunteer, hey, would you feel comfortable? Who would you want to reach out to? Because you need to be able to control the narrative of, hey, here's a list of people you could reach out to. Others have already given, or whatever. You need to have that narrative in place to say, no, I'm sorry, you can't reach out to them because of XYZ. And it doesn't have to be the full truth, but you need to be able to have the ownership as a school to say, we appreciate you being willing to reach out to them. We would rather take that on. Something that you want to also keep in mind with giving is you only want to give your volunteers the knowledge of has someone given or not. You don't want to show them dollar values of if they've given in the past. You might want to give that information of this is a loyal donor. You can easily add that into your email, but never enclose giving amounts to your volunteers unless there's extenuating circumstances, but I'd be very hesitant to. The last is if you have other campaigns or any sort of competitions going on, what you want to think through is, okay, if they're matching gifts, really how that works with the volunteers going off on their own doing these initiatives. How are the systems matching up? So if they're matching gifts, how do you make sure that, is it matching up to X amount, that once X amount is reached, that your volunteers know to no longer put that in your language? Or, there are different tools that you need to consider of, again, the volunteers are operating on their own, but it's not in silo to everything else that's going on as a school initiative. So making sure there's cohesive communication in both directions so that volunteers, if again, you're giving them instructions in the first place saying, hey, this is the protocol to reach out. In those instructions, you would write, heads up, we have a matching gift opportunity. We will inform you if that needs to change, if that changes the template. So that gives them the warning to check back in, or that they know that you will email them if anything changes. So just setting those expectations to start. So I've covered a bunch today and I've talked at you all a lot. I will do a quick kind of close out in a second, but I want to make sure I give you time. If you have questions you want to make sure we cover, or if there's anything you want to dive deeper into, please let me know. And if not, we're going to give you back some time. All right, so when it comes to volunteers, we've covered really setting your expectations, writing it out, making sure you know who you should be recruiting and getting the right recruits in the door. Have that list of your training needs and materials for your volunteers, and make sure you're tracking correctly. Back to the tracking point, when you are conversing with leadership or with your larger team, make sure you're talking about the right types of numbers here. So in terms of engagement outreach. These are percentages of total alumni who were reached out to out of the total alumni base, versus this is the percentage of people contacted that we have emails on, versus this is the donations from different channels. There are so many different ways to track. Make sure that the metrics you're tracking is being clearly communicated and you're talking about the same numbers. So once you've got that definition, you want to make sure that you have oversight into how communication is happening with your volunteers, whether it's a reporting, it's a log, whatever it is. You need to make sure that the volunteers are completing their tasks in a timely manner, so that if there's anyone who drops the ball, and it's going to happen, life happens, you have the protocols in place to be able to step in, so you as a school could reach out to those people that were never contacted. That way, there's no money left on the table that could easily have been, brought in if it was simply just an email wasn't sent. When you're done tracking, you want to think through the full circle of, okay, we've got the fundraising completed. How do we end this? Not only are we thanking our donors, we're thanking our volunteers. And is there a way that we can do both at the same time in that recognition? And how can I keep them for next year or use them to help recruit others to bring in the door? So stay tuned for more later this month in my